What's up, yo? Welcome to Your One Life. I'm your host, Kim Young Kim, and I'm super glad to have you as a listener today as we dive into a multi-part series on an amazing book called Nonviolent Communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg. If you're new here, I would like to tell you what this podcast is all about. This podcast is all about teaching you from the greatest minds in the world, helping you in all aspects of your life, and showing you how to humble brag about your material possessions by turning it into a gratitude post on social media. Because every day is Thanksgiving when you're trying to flex on the gram. All right, so I want to start this episode by saying Happy Juneteenth to everyone in America. For those of you who aren't in America, this is a day we celebrate the freedom from slavery for African Americans in this country. All right, so today's episode is about a book called Nonviolent Communication by a man named Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, rest in peace, who created this idea of communicating nonviolently. I personally have invented violent silence, which is also known as silent but violent. So, we all make our contribution one way or another, right? Now, all jokes aside, Dr. Rosenberg experienced violence at a very early age. When he moved to Detroit in 1943, a terrible race riot broke out in that city, and as a kid, he was attacked for being Jewish by other kids who were very prejudiced. So as he experienced a bunch of violence, he decided he wanted to dedicate his life to helping people to not incite violence. And oftentimes, our communication turns into violence. And that's why he decided to come up with this framework. The framework is called Nonviolent Communication, but he would rather call it compassionate communication. And one of the things he says is violence causes harm unless you're weak and feeble, like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. But otherwise, violence causes harm, and even verbal and nonverbal violence causes harm. And he said, nonviolence, what it does is it stems from a place of true compassion. And as I cover this framework, what I will say is Dr. Rosenberg admits that it's very difficult for him to do this at times. The struggle is real. So if some of this stuff feels very difficult or even impossible, just know that struggling is normal and know that it's just par for the course. So as you're practicing the ideas of nonviolent communication, it'll feel like you're speaking a new language. You're going to fumble a lot. You might be even a little embarazado, which means pregnant in Spanish. Okay, so maybe you're not going to be that. But you will be a little embarrassed. You're going to fumble. You're going to screw up. And that is normal, right? And as you do this, you got to understand that this requires patience with yourself and also with others. Now, there's some extra support out there for you. Actually, a lot of his trainings where he's actually going through the nonviolent communication are available in recordings via podcast, and I'll make sure to tag those in the show notes. I highly, highly recommend after you listen to this series about nonviolent communication, you go check those out. He's a pretty funny guy, and the workshops are actually quite entertaining. So as you practice nonviolent communication, you got to realize that you have to be the bigger person in situations oftentimes as you do this. It also helps if you're physically larger than the person you are practicing it with because it requires vulnerability, which reminds me of a great quote from Jack Handy, those classic videos from Saturday Night Live, that goes, "It takes a big man to cry, but it takes an even bigger man to laugh at the man who's crying." Now, all jokes aside, you will have to be the bigger person, and that's a good thing to do. It's good to be the bigger person in situations because here's the deal. When you're the bigger person, you get to tell people in the future how you were the bigger person as you talk about things in perhaps a podcast that you create or just stories you tell. And regardless how you communicate that you are a bigger person, the key is to make sure you let it be known. All right, now as we're talking about nonviolent communication, I'm going to call it NVC for short throughout the podcast. Try it with reasonable people first. This is just an idea I came up with as I was thinking about this, because if you try it with reasonable people, they'll be more empathetic and understanding. especially as you make mistakes along the way. And this is going to feel very touchy-feely, and part of that is because it is. And it really doesn't matter if it's touchy-feely, because at the end of the day, what matters is that you are effective communicating, that you get along with people that are around you in your world, and that you live a peaceful life. And so try it with reasonable people. And if you have unreasonable people in your life, try to limit your time with them. But NVC will help a great deal with dealing with unreasonable people. Now, with NVC, it actually works best when both people understand how to do it. It's kind of like sign language if only one person knows how to do it. I've been told that's not so great. But jokes aside, a lot of couples actually go through NVC training together. One other thing that I thought of as I was writing this script is don't announce in a conversation that you're going to be engaging in NVC with them. That's like announcing in this conversation, I'm going to be the bigger person. That's just weird. Don't do that. Okay, so now that I've talked about what not to do, here's something you do need to do, which is listening to people. Listening to people is key because we all want to be listened to. We all want to feel important. And if you want to make someone angry, one of the best ways to do that is don't listen to them while they're talking. Also, hitting them with a ketchup bottle works pretty well too. It's a prank, bro. It's actually assault. Have fun in jail, brother. So, NVC, nonviolent communication. What are the two driving questions in this framework? Well, here's one of them. What's alive in you? Tapeworms. Here's the second question. What would make your life more wonderful? Probably not having tapeworms. Now, jokes aside, the question, what's alive in you, has to do with your feelings, and what would make your life even more wonderful has to do with your need. And that's what it's all about. Your feelings and your needs, right? And all of us have feelings, all of us have needs. So we need to learn how to communicate these feelings and needs in a way that actually gets these feelings addressed and these needs met, and vice versa with other people. So what you're going to do is you're going to focus on empathy and compassion. It's important to stay in human connection with whoever you're interacting with. And if you do that, it helps everyone get what they need. So essentially, MVC is giving from the heart. It's kind of like a plasma donation. I think that's how that works. I don't know much about biology. But if you do this, if you give from the heart and you focus on empathy and compassion, people will join in with you. And eventually, what will happen is you'll be able to respond compassionately to one another. And this works best with reasonable people. The more unreasonable the person you're dealing with, the less effective this will be. But regardless, this works on very unreasonable people, and you will discover this throughout this podcast episode. And if you decide to pick up the book, which I highly recommend. So what is nonviolent communication? According to Rosenberg, it's not just a way of communicating. It's a way of keeping attention focused on a place where we are more likely to get what we are seeking. So it's essentially a selfish thing to do. And if you're like me, you're saying selfish. Now you're speaking my language, baby. Let's go. And Rosenberg discusses this in one of his trainings. He says, everything a person does, they do it to get what they want. Even the nice things that you do for other people, maybe your spouse or your partner, what do you want from them? Why are you doing that? You're doing it because you want them to feel beautiful and special and not publicly shame you on Facebook. By the way, if that is happening in your relationship, that is a red flag. You need to put on your Nikes and run for the hills. But everything you do essentially is to get something that you want. Even when a parent is taking care of their child, they're taking care of that child because what do they want? They want that child to be happy, healthy, and feel loved. So that, even though it is a selfless thing, it is also a selfish thing. And he talks about the paradox of this. He talks about the paradox of giving to actually get, right? And this reminds me of Dale Carnegie's quote where he says, you can make more friends in 2 weeks by being interested in other people than you can make in 2 months by trying to get other people interested in you. And that's real. In order to get people to interact with you, you have to make them feel important. You need to listen and you need to understand how important listening is, right? The best salespeople are not the best talkers. They are the best listeners because they listen. They're in tune to what their customer or their client needs, and then they deliver on that thing. And that's how you make a sale, by meeting people's needs. And that's how you succeed in life, by listening and meeting people's needs. Now, there's a story in the book about this guy who was drunk and he lost his keys and he was looking for them in the street. And a police officer comes up to him and say, hey, did you drop your keys in the street? And he goes, no, I actually dropped them in the alley, but the light is much better here. What was that guy doing? He was looking in the wrong place for his key. And that's what oftentimes we do. We use violent communication to get what we want, to get our needs met, and that is not the way to go. And so what you got to do is you literally have to fumble in a dark alley, because essentially that's where your keys are, and that's an analogy for nonviolent communication right there. Will it be easy? Will it be comfortable? No, it will not. Will you find what you're looking for? Yes, you will. All right, so what are the 4 components of nonviolent communication? First one is observation. So what is someone saying or doing that's enriching or not enriching our lives? For example, you notice that your coworker is eating your sandwich. Now, at this point, when you're observing something, you don't need to make judgments. You don't need to interpret the situation and say to yourself, oh, this punk's looking for trouble. You don't need to evaluate the situation. You don't need to pass judgment. You just need to observe what's happening. And then what you do is you state your feelings when you observe the action in question. So you state your feelings to yourself and you say, I'm feeling quite murderous. Okay, boom. Step 2 done. Step 3, state your needs that are connected to your feelings that you've identified. So you might say to yourself, I need them to choke on that sandwich, and then ask for forgiveness as I shame them for their theft before I offer helping them with a Heimlich maneuver. Or maybe another need you have is you need them to stop biting into your sustenance. And the 4th thing you do is you state a request for them. So in this case, you request that they pay restitution for their crime. I mean, the eating of your sandwich. And as you make that request, this whole time, you need to stay connected to their humanity. Because maybe this coworker felt like their boss was pushing them around. They thought your sandwich belonged to their boss, and they were extracting revenge. Or maybe they had an equally good reason. Now, this actually happened to me at work one day. One of my coworkers popped off on me when I asked a very basic question about COVID that was just a little misinformed. And she just popped off on me. And this was so out of character for her because she's a super, super sweet person and very kind. It's the first time that anything like this has ever happened between her and I. And I didn't know how to respond besides saying, whoa, chill out. Which isn't nonviolent communication per se. But as I responded pretty maturely to the situation, because, I'm all about being a bigger person, she immediately apologized. And then she mentioned all this crazy stuff that happened this morning. And she was like, yo, you didn't deserve that. Here's what's going on in my life. And of course, everything was fine at that point. Everything was smoothed out. Now, I did slash her tires 2 weeks later because I wanted to make sure she didn't know it was me. That's how you got to do. Let it all cool off and then extract your revenge. Life hacks, baby. Let's go. And here's the deal. What is the normal MO for people in general? The normal MO when someone blows up on you is to blow back up on them, or at least to tell them to stop raising their voice. That's what I do. I say, hey, stop raising your voice at me, because being yelled at activates the lizard brain. And so what you got to do, according to Rosenberg, is you need to sense what the other person is feeling, needing, and requesting. And this, of course, is a very mature response. But your job is to uncover what's going on. And then when you do, There will be a flow of communication between you two until compassion manifests naturally. And this will make a lot more sense when we get into actual examples. Now, he's taken his framework to Rwanda, to Serbia, to the Middle East, and he uses this to actually create peace between people who were once enemies. So he says, when you practice NVC, listen for the feelings behind each statement. And as you listen, don't disregard your own feelings because they're core to the process. But don't allow your feelings to stop you from communicating in a compassionate way. And this is hard. When someone's yelling at you, this is a level of Zen that isn't easy. So maybe one of the things that you can say is, please don't raise your voice at me if that is triggering. But as you interact with people, as you implement NVC, what's going to end up happening is as you respond with compassion, people will respond back with compassion as well. Because you've already experienced this probably in your life. When someone starts getting angry and raising their voice and becoming combative, then if the other person responds that same way, things just start to blow up, things just start to escalate, and that's when the police are called, right? And as things escalate, what you want to do is you want to de-escalate the situation, and the best way to do so is to actually listen for the feelings and the needs behind each statement. All right, let me summarize that real quick. You need to listen to all of their words, get a sense of their feelings from what's heard, and flow communication is a natural creation, so listen with compassion till it's served. That's right, listen with compassion. Moving on, let's talk about what Marshall says is life-alienating versus life-giving communication. Here are some examples of life-alienating communication. Moralistic judgment, like calling someone selfish or lazy or immoral. He states in the book that there's too much emphasis on good versus bad and all the other labels that we put on people when they're acting a way that we're not happy with. So calling your partner or your friend being needy or saying that they're being insensitive, those are all things that we shouldn't be doing. And he says when we do this, when we make moralistic judgments on people, we pay and then they pay. Because what ends up happening, there's this resentment in the people, there's this decreased self-esteem in them, and oftentimes they respond with fear, guilt, and shame, and sometimes they respond with violence as well. And what he says is classifying and judging people promotes violence. And using phrases like those people or us versus them, that is not a thing that Rosenberg is behind. And he says you can have values, you can have ideas that you hold dear and near to you, but you need to keep them in value judgments versus moralistic judgments. What's an example of that? Saying violence is bad is a value judgment, and violent people are evil is a moralistic judgment. So you got to know the difference between the two. And we see this on TV all the time, right? We see people on cable news networks just tearing each other apart, talking past each other, seeing the other person as an enemy, disregarding their humanity, judging them. And that's not a way that you're going to get to what you want in life. Having a civil discourse is the way, and that's what Marshall Rosenberg is trying to teach us. Another thing he says, don't compare. Making comparisons is a bad thing, and it's a life-alienating thing. Here's an exercise that he mentions in the book, telling people to look at a picture of a person who has what's known as a perfect body, and then comparing their body to that person's body. That's not going to be very helpful. Or going through Mozart's achievements in his life, and then comparing them to your achievements. Well, what's that going to do? That's going to make you feel alienated. Every now and then, comparison is helpful. For example, what I want you to do is I want you to compare your body to Mozart's on his deathbed. Bang. You probably feel really good about yourself right now. Another thing he says is life alienating is the denial of responsibility. Saying things like, oh, I drink because I'm an alcoholic, or I have to do this because it's a matter of policy that I drink alcohol. I can't make an exception for your circumstance. Denying responsibility, saying the group pressured you into it, saying you couldn't help to prevent your impulses from doing that is a very, very life alienating thing. And he says we are dangerous when we are not conscious of our responsibility in all things regarding our behavior, how we think, and also how we feel. So he's a big proponent of personal responsibility, and that's a win in my book. Another thing he says that is life alienating is communicating your desires as demands. And as you make these demands, you're going to say, hey, you know what? If you don't do this, you're going to take the blame or you're going to take this punishment. And he says this is not an effective tool and you really can't make anyone do anything. So don't try. And what he says, again, is he talks about moral judgments. He says we live in a society where some actions merit punishment and some actions merit rewards. And there's a part of the book that felt like a very slippery slope for me because you do need to live your values and you do need to punish people when they do bad things sometimes. That's why we have a criminal justice system. But also, the criminal justice system is very imperfect and very broken. So I do understand what he's saying. One of the things that he says is most of us grow up with language that encourages us to label people, to make comparisons, to make demands, to pronounce judgments. And what we need to do is we need to forget that language. And instead of that, what we need to do is we need to be aware of what we are feeling and what we're needing. Now, one interesting idea that he posed in the book is the language of wrongness is perfect for a society where there's a ruler and the obedient masses. And that was a really interesting thought when I heard that. I was like, oh yeah, that actually does make sense. If there is a rightness and a wrongness, the rulers in charge are there to pronounce that rightness and wrongness, and that's how you keep people under control. So he recommends what you got to do instead of making judgments is make evaluations. Mike is a terrible friend is an evaluation. Mike tried to body slam me at Publix today is an observation. The key word is tried and died. Now, I think you can see the difference between the two. Also, when you are saying someone never does something or always does something, what that is it's basically blaming, and it's a very dicey thing to say, and it can elicit some very strong emotions from people. So instead of saying, you never pay when we go out, you can actually make an observation and say, in the past 73 times we've gone out, you haven't paid. Now, at that point, I want to know, is this dining and dashing or some deadbeat boyfriend? Hopefully not the latter. One of the things he says as you are communicating with people is focus on your feelings, right? When you communicate, you actually have to focus on actual feelings. So saying, I feel ignored is not an actual feeling because ignored is not a feeling. Lonely is a feeling. Angry is a feeling, right? Ignored is all about what other people are doing towards you, but the feelings that you have after they ignore you, that's actually what feelings are. And I know this is hard to understand. I highly, highly recommend you listening to the podcast with the workshops to get the full gist of this framework. All right, so he says there are 4 steps of expressive nonviolent communication. I'm going to go over them one more time. Observe without evaluating. So maybe you make mention of the fact that your date is eating up all the loaded nachos instead of eating a equal amount of loaded and unloaded nachos. By the way, that's from a show called I Think You Should Leave on Netflix. Oof, that's such a funny sketch. But you're observing and you're not saying, hey, you're a selfish person. You're just saying, I noticed that you're eating a lot of the loaded nachos. Now, after you observe, you identify and express your feelings. So very important to have a vocabulary of your feelings. There's a lot of emotions out there that you can feel. And if you are murky on this concept, You might want to go and listen to the series on the book, Why Hasn't Anyone Told Me This Before? Or pick up the book, because it'll be very helpful in helping you to verbalize your feelings. So here's an example of identifying and expressing your feelings. Saying, I feel like I'm living with a wall is actually not identifying any sort of actual feelings, but here's a way to communicate what this person is trying to say. Instead of saying, I feel like I'm living with the wall, you can say, I feel lonely when you don't engage with me. I feel sad when you stare off into the distance. I feel disheartened when I break my hand punching your rock-hard abs. Now, someone said this to me just yesterday. Just kidding. These are jokes. It was actually their foot that they broke. But verbalizing your feelings is key. Here's an example of properly verbalizing your feelings. I'm angry that you bailed on me because I had to go to the event alone and I felt uncomfortable flying solo at a couple's retreat. Boom. There it is. That person is expressing their feelings very well. Now, once you express your feelings, what you got to do is connect your feelings to a need. And when you express your needs through evaluations, through interpretations, people, what they're going to hear is criticism. And when anybody hears criticism, they turn to self-defense and they counterattack oftentimes. So what you got to do is stick to the facts, talk about your feelings, and then talk about your needs. So let's say you're talking to a mugger and you say to them, you are a violent person who loves to steal. You need to flip that around into talking about your feelings and your needs. So instead, what you should say is, I am sad when you wave a weapon in my face and take my money because I am unable to pay rent when you do. Boom. You got a feeling and you got a need. So talk about what you need. Don't talk about what the other person is doing wrong, right? Say, hey, I need my car to get to work versus, hey, I'm not a fan of carjacking. There it is, right? So as we're talking about needs and feelings, traditionally the cultural norms have been women aren't supposed to have needs and men aren't supposed to have feelings. And so what you got to do is you got to toss cultural norms aside and realize that all humans have feelings, all humans have needs. So focus on those two things. Now, here's what happens when you don't express your needs. You end up suffering. Marshall's mom grew up very, very poor, and she wanted material things like all kids do, but because they were poor, she was actually trained not to ask for anything. So a story from when she was a child was that Marshall's sister got an appendectomy, and to cheer her up, her parents bought her a fancy beaded purse. And so she saw that purse and she's like, I would love a fancy beaded purse, but I can't ask for that because we're poor. So she actually faked an appendix problem so she could end up getting a purse too. But the doctors couldn't find anything. And so what they did is they did an exploratory surgery and found nothing. And then she got the purse and she was happy. Now, as she was sitting in the hospital bed, she showed the purse to a nurse, and the nurse actually thought it was a gift for her, and she took it. And Marshall's mom did not have the ability to state her needs and say, no, I didn't mean to give you the purse. Please return it to me. Yikes. Holy cow. This is the ultimate example of why it's so important to express your needs and also why it's important not to lie. Good gosh. You're left with stitches, a scar, and no purse. Oof. All right, moving on. In the book, Marshall refers to the state of emotional liberation. It is a state where we respond to people's needs with compassion, not out of fear or guilt or shame or any of that, right? But just out of compassion. And we accept full responsibility of our own feelings and not the feelings of other people. We also accept responsibility for our intentions and our actions. Now, you may not ever get to the state of emotional liberation. It seems like a very, very enlightened state, but that is what you should be aiming for. Now, the fourth step of NVC is making specific requests, right? Be clear about what you want. So let's say someone is being mistreated by their partner and they say, hey, stop treating me so badly. Well, what does that exactly mean? Maybe they get more specific and they say, stop yelling at me. And the partner says, okay, hey, you stupid idiot, answer the door. And then that person gets mad and they're like, what's the problem? I wasn't yelling. And then that's an opportunity to say, hey, call me by my name and make requests instead of making demand. Do you see the difference in that? You have to be very, very specific about what you want, because if you're not specific, you're not going to get what you want. I remember way back in the day when I was in college, I had this roommate, and my roommate got on my nerves. And the younger version of me expected people to be able to read my mind. And my roommate couldn't read my mind. And he would say things that would get on my nerves, and he would call me hip hop, which I didn't like. But I never verbalized that I didn't like that. And so he continued to do it. And I've done this with other people as well. I've given people kind of like pet names as a term of endearment. And I kept doing it to give them like a cool little nickname based on their name. And months later, they tell me, hey, I don't like it when you do that. And I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me the first time? Right? So all of us are guilty of expecting people to read our minds. And you need to make sure that you don't do that. You need to make sure that you communicate what it is you want. And you need to understand also that sometimes when someone says something, they're just making an observation. And sometimes they're making a request. So you need to get clarity on that. Like if they say, hey, I'm annoyed by these bloodthirsty vampires, aka Comcast Xfinity. And if someone says something like this in your presence, and maybe they're your partner or spouse or whatever it is, you should ask them, hey, is there something you would like me to do, or are you just registering a complaint? And speaking of companies that don't listen, oof, Comcast Xfinity, worst company ever. And as you make a request, make sure that you give a reason for the request. For example, I would like you to go to the doctor because I need an afternoon to myself. Actually, a doctor's visit probably won't last that long. I need you to go check into the ER because I need an afternoon to myself. Boom. There it is. Honesty is the best policy. I'm sure your person will understand. And as you communicate, make sure that your message is understood and get them to state it back to you, which, this is one of those parts of the book where I'm just like, this could get heated. And it actually mentions in the book that this can be heated. So what you can do is put the onus on you and say, hey, I'm working on my communication and I need to improve it. So I was wondering if you could reflect back what I requested of you. And as you make requests, get honest feedback. You need feedback. You need to know what the listener is thinking and feeling. And also if they'd be willing to take the particular action you ask. So again, we're listening for honest feedback. And as we do, make sure that your requests are not demands, right? Because when you make a demand, you're either going to get submission or rebellion, and neither of those are very good for your friendship, for your family relationship, or any relationship, right? Both of those lead to resentment. Recently, I had a family member actually make a demand versus a request for a ride to the airport. And what made me the angriest about it is they wanted a piggyback ride. That's right. They wanted to ride on my back like I'm a pack mule. And I said, no, sirree, we are not doing that. I am not hauling you down the highway on my back. Go find yourself another patsy. I am not the one. All right. So as you make a request, what you need to know is if you guilt trip them, then it becomes a demand. But if they say no and you empathize with them, then you can possibly get them to continue with the request that you're asking. It's all about listening. It's all about empathizing and then moving forward from there. Because they may have a very valid response and a very valid reason why they don't want to fulfill the request that you made. And if you hear that, then that will give you an opportunity to listen and then also continue on with the request if you want to. And if not, maybe finding a solution that works for everybody. And he says, be wary of any thoughts that turn your requests into demands, like he should be cleaning up after himself, or I deserve a raise, or I have a right to hack into her email. No, you have a right to remain silent. And anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of divorce. So, yeah, don't do that. Don't do that, okay? Okay, cool. I'm going to wrap up the 4 steps of nonviolent communication, and we're going to call it a wrap. Yo, check the things that I'm stating. I'm talking about observation. I'm talking about all the things that you need to see with your eyes, and that's how you rise. And that's what I'm saying. Don't just see the things that they're doing and just judge them. That's what I'm saying, because you will begrudge them. You will make them really quite angry and really quite defensive. And that's what I'm saying. Don't do something offensive. Just straight see what you're going to see. And just be that person right there to understand what your feelings are. That's what I'm saying. Dropping these bars, talk about things that are in your chest. And that's what I'm saying. Don't let them rest. You got to bring them out. And that's what I'm saying. No freaking doubt. You got to understand what it is in you. And that's how you come through. And that's how you win true. That's what I'm saying. You got to connect those feelings and needs. And you got to see what it is you need right now in this moment. And that's what I'm saying. You got to own it. Basically, what I'm saying is that's the only way you're going to get your needs for your met with a request. Basically, what I'm saying, you got to be specific and just tell them what you needed right now. And that's what I'm saying. You got to freaking write down every single thing that you have up in your mind. And that's what I'm saying. When I'm busting a rhyme, you got to just ask and just listen with empathy. And that's how you be chilling all the time and having a good time. And that's what I'm saying. End of the rhyme. I spit out the top. And that's how it goes. All 4 steps up in the flow. All right. That's that. End of the first episode on nonviolent communication. I'm breaking up my regular schedule in order to not have big gaps between these episodes. So you will be getting another episode next week. If you are new here, don't forget to hit follow so that you don't miss future episodes. And for those of you who have been listening, please rate and review the podcast in Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That helps significantly with getting good guests, getting the word out, the whole 9. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is one of the more difficult episodes that I've done, but I'm grateful for this learning. I'm grateful to be able to distribute this to y'all, and I hope you do something really positive with it and you implement it so you can get along with people and have good relationships. Shout out to my dude Siraj for making the instrumental for this podcast. And shout out to you for all the positive things that you're going to do with the learnings from this episode. This is Your One Life. I'm Kim Young Kim. Hope you have a great day, a great week. And until next time, peace.